Thanks, Lascan Corley. Firstly, I want to say that the whole issue of equality is at the core of what we believe should be modern republicanism. We've long promoted the idea of an Ireland of equals, indeed a Europe of equals, and we don't see this as just a hollow election slogan to be dusted down at election time. We're committed to trying to build a united Ireland where equality is at the centre of how we measure the nation's success. The equality has to include social, political and economic equality. Unfortunately, for citizens on the island, we see in Ireland is far more unequal now, unfortunately, at times in the past. Consecutive governments have pursued policies that have created inequality. Previous governments have contributed, indeed, to the level of inequality that we have today. In fact, we had one government minister here in the past, Minister for Justice. He promoted inequality. Former Minister McDowell, he actually said, and I quote, that a dynamic liberal economy like ours demands flexibility and inequality in some respects to function, unquote. And he went on to say that it is such inequality which provides incentives, unquote. So in November of last year, anyway, that was his view, hopefully we moved on from that, but in November of last year, our party pledged our support for the Equality Budgeting Campaign. The Equality Budgeting Campaign is a broad-based coalition of trade unions, community groups and NGOs who are seeking the introduction of equality budgeting in this state. Simply put, the whole idea of equality budgeting means that no government could introduce a budget without it first being equality proofed. And it's no surprise that governments have failed to embrace this process. Their budgets that we've seen here in the past wouldn't ever get into this House or see the light of day if they were equality proofed. So what's our bill, the Equal Status, Sinn Féin Equal Status Amendment Bill 2013 to do? Basically, it has three aims. Firstly, it will add 6 new additional anti-discriminatory categories to the already existing 9. Namely, Sinn Féin will include trade union membership, socio-economic background, Irish language speakers Gaelgories, former political prisoners, and previous speaker made reference to this about offences. We're talking about there is people, this is in the Good Friday Agreement. You may not be familiar with this, but this was actually in the Good Friday Agreement and agreed to in negotiations. That's what we're talking about. People who are in prison in relation to the conflict and who have served their sentences or who got early release under the Good Friday Agreement. And rural dwellers. Secondly, it will introduce equality impact assessment, and all public bodies and government departments would have to implement this. And thirdly, and very importantly, it will introduce the whole notion of equality budgeting. And this is where economic policy making and planning places equality at the centre of decision making concerning public expenditure and income. One particular issue I want to raise is the right to join and be represented by a trade union. You have the right to join, but you don't have the right to be represented. And we must remember that any gains made by ordinary working people and their families was achieved after campaigning and struggling. And without trade unions, many of the gains that we now take for granted would never have been achieved. If we take the issues of child labour, maternity benefits, annual leave, 40-hour working week, and it could go on, all of those were successfully won, not because the likes of William Martin Murphy woke up one morning and said he was going to grant all of this. It's because trade unions won the fight. Here in this city, we're commemorating the 100th anniversary of the 1913 lockout. And in streets around here, people were engaged in a huge struggle, an epic struggle, over the right to join and be represented by trade unions. Of course, led by Connolly and Larkin, who gave leadership and dignity to people. So while it's not only appropriate here tonight that we reflect on the gains made by trade unions, we must also reflect on the challenges facing us. How much has really changed? And if you look at it, sadly, Minister, there's a lot of workers remain fearful of the consequences of joining a trade union, and I'm sure you come across them the same as I do. And it's shameful that 100 years after the Great Lockout, that men and women live in fear of what their employer will do if they join a trade union. And this is a very common issue out there, and I feel very strongly about it. I have met trade union organisers in the Midlands on this very matter, and they recount stories of workers, men and women, living in fear of even being associated with trade unionism, never mind joining a union. I have met some of those workers. In particular, this problem prevails in the meat industry, where some employers, in the race to the bottom to increase profits, have employed immigrant workers on the minimum wage, and in some cases reported to be even below that, and proceeded to isolate them from the rest of the workforce. When the unions attempt to engage with and organise the workers, they're met with a wall of silence and fear. Fathers, we've had situations where fathers are using their children's sons and daughters to translate stories to union organisers on bullying and victimisation in the workplace and threats from employers. And this is unacceptable and shouldn't be tolerated in an Ireland of the 21st century. Hopefully our bill, we attempt to help overcome this, or some of this fear. It will make it illegal to discriminate or bully workers who organise themselves in a union. So it's nearly 100 years since the lockout this year, and it's long overdue that we take steps to address this. What I want to highlight in my last few minutes is the whole inequality in our communities. For years, the great and the good, and people in governments on occasions, have dismissed any debate on the whole issue of inequality as airy-fairy. But you can no longer dismiss those arguments. The boast of us being a low-tax economy has serious negative social effects. We've only to look at a number of telling statistics. The number of children living in poverty has increased by 32,000 since last year, from 200,000 in 2012 to 232,000 in 2013. That's nearly 1 in 5 children living in poverty, while the number of people overall living in poverty has jumped from 706,000 to 731,000 during the same period. This is the human face of inequality and the austerity. It forces people into poverty and divides society with devastating consequences. The overall tax take in this state as a percentage of GDP is at 31.3%, well below the European average of 35.6%. And when you link this to the starting figure of 11.49 billion, that's the figure that this government grants in tax reliefs. And we must seriously look at this, and I would urge the government to look at this and run into the budget. So it is really the case that people who are wealthy are getting more wealthy, and that continues to be the case. The book Spirit Level, in that book written by Richard G. Wilkinson and Kate Pickett, they claimed that for each of 11 different health and social problems, such as physical health, mental health, drug abuse, education, imprisonment, obesity, social mobility, trust in community life, violence and teenage pregnancy, and child well-being, that the outcomes are significantly worse in more unequal countries. And we know that from looking around the globe. And their striking conclusion is that societies that do best for their citizens are those that have the narrowest income differentials. The Nordic countries, for example, have the best. The most unequal ones, the United States and the United Kingdom, do the worst. So in conclusion, Ceann Comhairle, the question is where do we want Ireland to be in a few years' time? Do we want a more unequal society, or do we want a more equal one that's safer, more caring and more productive? I believe that we should say yes to that.